This week, we bought a Ouija board, stocked up on pea soup, and called a priest. Because this week, we got possessed by the idea to rewatch The Exorcist.
Welcome back to How Did You Miss This? A show where the power of Christ compels us to exorcise our movie-watching demons. I'm Evan Toller-Hickey, and with me as always, Michael Hansen and Chris DeShane. And today, we are going back to rewatch the OG, the scariest movie of all time, 1973's The Exorcist. This movie, celebrating 50 years this year, is one of the greatest horror movies ever made. I think that we can say that with a fair amount of authority. None of us have missed it, but we wanted to revisit it during Scaretober because it's got a sequel releasing pretty soon after we release this episode. Michael, I'm very curious what your relationship to this movie is, especially because it stars national treasure Max von Sydow. So I imagine that this was required viewing for 7-year-olds in Sweden.
Did you watch it when you were 8 years old? Because you could watch anything you wanted.
That's pretty much it. It's like probably not when I was 7, but I don't remember when I watched it. I had such vague recollections of this movie, and probably was around like 10 or 11 years old. Because you're right, like anything like that. First of all, American movie, if that was on television, check. With Swedish national treasure, that just bumps up the ante even more. So yeah, that would have been required viewing for everyone.
Chris, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of already touched on it in Scaretober so far. Like, I had an older brother who liked horror movies. This is something that I probably would have seen for the first time in university, you know, like my early 20s or something like that. I probably haven't watched it since then. I remember at the time being like, all right, that's pretty good, but not necessarily being in love with it. So it was interesting to revisit it, you know, 20 years later and on its kind of 50th anniversary to see how well it holds up. But Evan, I know this is for you like a treasured gem in your collection, right?
This is truly a treasured gem in my collection. So, you know, full disclosure, The Exorcist is one of my like top 5 favorite films. I love this film so much. I think it is so extraordinarily well crafted and holds up to time and lends itself to all kinds of different readings and lenses and analyses. I get something new every time I watch it. I first watched this movie, like you, Chris, in university. A roommate of mine had it, and we watched it. And while I didn't find it like the scariest thing I had ever seen, it is one of those movies that has stuck with me. I think it's actually a really beautiful film, and I'm really, really excited to talk about it with both of you today.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting chat. And I think the course of this movie getting made is kind of fascinating, too, just because it is such a weird series of events that comes together. Because like the expectation for this movie was that it wasn't, I mean, it was a horror movie being made in 1973. I don't think the expectations on this were really much of anything as it was getting made. And I think the kind of thing that it's become, this, you know, cultural phenom that's lasted 50 years and has these kind of like deep tendrils out into all sorts of film and horror and whatever, all these different alleyways that it's kind of gone down, like definitely not what was expected while it was being made. I mean, this was a movie while it was being made in the early 70s that was basically going to get kind of like tossed in after Christmas. Let's see how it does. This movie was made on a budget of $12 million, although the original budget was actually a lot less than that, except the production of this movie was so insanely difficult that it ran well over 100 days over its original allotment of 85 days of filming. That is
so brutal for the producers.
Yeah, exactly. And you hear all these stories about while it was being filmed, like in order to make the scenes in the bedroom, realistic, they basically had it as like a freezer, right? They had the temperature so low so that you could see the actor's breath and it was freezing cold. But what they had to do that was basically make it a freezer, turn all the lights off, turn all the equipment off, and then they could film for maybe 3 or 4 minutes because the temperature would come up so quickly with all of the lighting and all the stuff going that they could only film scenes like 3 or 4 minutes at a time before they had to shut everything down and then come back to it. And then there's all sorts of stuff about the production where a lot of the actors got injured, people on the set got killed or injured, and like all sorts of stuff like that, which some people were saying is, because it was cursed, because it was haunted, which I think is more of a marketing thing. It's probably more of the like trying to push the production schedule and cutting corners and maybe not making sure things are quite as safe as you needed to, because you're already 100 days over,
Exactly. It certainly lends to the mystique of the film, though. The whole idea of this sort of like demonic film, not just, it being a film that's really scary, but like, like this production and, and getting that into the media hype machine. It certainly didn't hurt The Exorcist when it came out. And, like you said, Chris, it's got like a $12 million budget, but this gets released just after Christmas, 1973. And I mean, to massive gross, like $200 million on its initial release, which I guess sort of converted into today money is like $1 billion. So like a true blockbuster, kind of almost even before the idea of blockbuster as we know it gets solidified in the later 70s with Jaws and Star Wars and stuff like that.
I think the thing that puts it in context, like how big this movie was, right? Its initial release made over $200 million, and until 2017, it was still the highest grossing R-rated movie out there, even without accounting for inflation, right? So it passed it in 2017. Until then, that $200 million on its initial release was still the highest grossing R-rated movie. Like that's how successful this movie was. And again, to your point, Evan, if you adjust for inflation, that's $1 billion. Nobody has passed that, right? Like it's so runaway successful. And it's kind of crazy that it starts on like 30 screens as a kind of like throwaway, post-holiday scary movie that the like Warner Brothers didn't expect to do anything. And it was so successful that they had no option except to roll it out nationally and like get rid of some of their other films that they were trying to get onto screens in order to put The Exorcist out on more screens nationally.
Yeah. And, of course, you've also got, like we talked about, that kind of hype machine of like cursed production. But also this was one of those films where, you had all of conversations around or the hype around like people vomiting in the aisles and people leaving the theaters and having like heart attacks in the theaters. And, so it definitely, and of course, the backlash from the Christian right, which then, kind of makes it like taboo. And then, of course, people want to see it even more. And all through that as well, the film garners like some pretty great reviews. You get things like Stanley Kaufman for the New Republic saying it's like the only scary movie I've seen in years, or Michael Dempsey calling The Exorcist like the trash bombshell of 1973, the aesthetic equivalent of being run over by a truck, which not a great one. And I think that Ebert, Roger Ebert, echoes that in saying that, like, are people so numb that they need movies of this intensity in order to feel anything at all? But at the same time gives the movie 4 stars and praises the acting and the special effects and compares it to a Bergman film that really moved him in cinema that had come out at the beginning of that year, and talks about in that review, like, just how affecting this movie is, using all of the language of cinema and all of the tricks available to cinema to create something truly, truly effective and affecting. And that also bears out in award season.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think the crazy thing about this is the thing you do not associate with horror movies is awards for the most part. And yet this is a movie that's nominated for 10 Academy Awards, 7 Golden Globes. It wins 2 Academy Awards and 4 Golden Globes. But the crazy thing is, a cast of relatively unknown or totally unknown actors in some cases. So you got Ellen Burstyn in the lead, Max von Sydow, who is largely unknown in the US at this point, Jason Miller, Linda Blair, who are basically new faces. All of them come away from this movie with award nominations for, either Best Supporting Actor or Actress at the Academy Awards or at the Golden Globes. Linda Blair actually wins a Golden Globe for her role in this movie. Like, these kind of unknown actors and this kind of throwaway movie come away with 17 nominations in the biggest film awards there are, and wind up walking away with 6. And in fact, there's some people who were angry and complaining and frustrated that it didn't even actually receive more recognition, more awards, and more of that kind of thing. I think part of that goes back to the fact that it was released on December 26th. And that snowball effect would have been probably building into awards season. I don't know that it necessarily had the recognition that it would have had by, say, a year later while it was still showing, because this movie basically stayed in theaters for like 2 years. It was so successful. So maybe if, timing would be different, it might have actually racked up more. It's hard to say, but it's pretty unparalleled that you have a horror movie that comes away with this kind of, critical recognition. And to your point, like, the reviews were a little bit mixed, and I think there's some stuff we can talk about as we go through it about why that may have been, but it's certainly a film that gets above and beyond recognition from critics, from audiences. Like, this is definitely a phenomenon of its time.
And yet, for all of that critical acclaim, I mean, I will say that it only has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 77%, which I think is just way too low for a film like this. But, 77%, better than a number of things that we've seen. So I guess really the question here is, are both of you happy to have revisited this film, especially in this context of doing it for Scaretober? Michael?
I'm really glad that we ended up picking this one, because this, compared to some of the other ones, the discussion can become things like, has it aged well? It is sometimes, it re-triggers something that you watched when you were younger, but it might not have translated today. I agree with you. I think this has aged well, except for some things that I'm going to bring up later about makeup, etc. But I actually think it was super interesting to watch it again, because it was not what I remembered. I'll give you a basic example. In my head, I thought it was a black and white movie, simply because of that famous fog sort of night scene. And I had completely forgotten that this is like the original Indiana Jones movie in the beginning, where they're doing like excavation, and there were so many things. So, oh yeah, wow. So I thought it was a great fun to watch again.
How about you, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think that whole 77% on Rotten Tomatoes, I mean, that's the same score as The Lost Boys has. And I don't think,
again, egregious.
I think that's a little high for The Lost Boys and maybe a little low for this. I think this is kind of one of those movies that's a little tricky because of, you kind of set it up front, like scariest movie ever and best horror movie. I'm like, I think, it's kind of like saying, what's the best meal ever? Well, that's kind of subjective, right? It really depends on your taste. I think this is a really good movie, like straight up. I think this is a really good movie. Do I think it's the best horror movie ever? Do I think it's yada? Like, I don't know. I think that's putting too high expectations on it for most people going in to watch it. But is 77% a little low? Yeah. Like, I was happy to rewatch this movie. Like, The Lost Boys kind of made me want to gouge my eyes out a little bit. Definitely not this movie. Like, this is a fun watch. And Evan, I'm guessing you're happy to rewatch this movie anytime.
Oh, I'm very happy to rewatch this movie anytime. This movie, I just think, like I said, is a great movie. This is a great piece of cinema, and I'm excited to talk about it a bit more. But I think that this truly does all of the things that cinema is supposed to do, and that art is supposed to do, in terms of creating cathartic experience, in terms of having an audience have a visceral and emotional reaction to a piece of art. This movie is so excellent in both, creating an atmosphere for the viewers to really sit in terror, and I just think that this movie's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gives you those creepy crawlies that you kind of want to feel creeping up your back or whatever at points. But let's maybe take that intermission, and then we can talk about how those creepy crawlies still feel all these 50 years later after it came out. Hopefully you got your popcorn, because we're about to get into the thick of things here with The Exorcist. So usual spoiler alert here. We're going to be talking about all the stuff about The Exorcist. If you haven't seen it, if you want to go find out, I mean, it's 50 years. I mean, maybe it's kind of fair to spoil it for you at this point, but just in case, here's your warning. So we're going to get into it here. And if you don't know what this movie is about, well, let me tell you. So a young girl named Reagan becomes possessed by a malevolent demon. I don't know if there's other kinds, but in this case, it's malevolent. Her mother is desperately seeking medical help to help her, but when conventional medicine fails, and with her daughter's life on the line, she turns to a Catholic priest for help. Now, this movie was hailed for its special effects and makeup. I mean, especially for Regan and her transformation. So 50 years later, do those special effects and makeup and all the stuff that went into making a little girl a demon, do those still hold up?
Yeah, I think the problem is the whole thing around like holding up. I think it holds up relatively well given how old it is. Looking at it today, the blood color, the sort of the extreme changes to the face, to me that's not super convincing. But I actually think it's held up a lot better than maybe some of the old sci-fi movies or certain things like that. It just, I could not take the blood seriously. I could not take some of the things in her transformation when it kind of got too far super seriously. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's held up well. It's just hard to look at it objectively from like today's perspective.
You know, I have to disagree with you, Michael. I think that it's rare that we see something that still looks this good. I would say, interestingly enough, the piece of special effect, and again, all of these are like basically practical effects. So I think that's one of the reasons why they hold up. These aren't sort of computer generated in 1973. But the spinning head looks just a little bit mechanical, but it's so visceral at the moment that it happens. It gives that, I think, that little bit of like, I will let this go. And then especially, it slams in on a close on Reagan's face, and her voice becomes, is it Burke's voice? And, you know what she did, your daughter. I'll refuse from using the expletive there. But I just think that all of that looks really good. And the little bits of subliminality, little flashes of Pazuzu's face, the demon's face here and there. The blood, the arterial blood that squirts during the medical scene, I think looks really good. And I think that the makeup in general and any of the sort of like levitating and things, just to me is really, really excellent.
Yeah, I'm largely with, I think you guys are actually kind of saying a similar thing, right? I think Michael's saying, especially for a 1973 movie, this movie has maintained its special effects. Like it's very good for a 50-year-old movie, especially. I definitely think there's moments where, you can see what's happening. The editing of Pazuzu's face into a couple points, to your point, Evan, like it's cool for 2023. Is it amazing? No, but for 1973, it's astounding, right? So it's kind of does it hold up? Yes, especially when you consider how old this film is. It still has that creep factor that's brought into it. The moments where you've got, I don't know, like Reagan's creepy, like she's scary, and that's like I think the most important part of this, because I think for a lot of this movie, they're trying to maintain tension and maintain that kind of scariness, which really needs to pay off when you get to creepy, scary time. And I think they do that, right? Creepy, scary time is still creepy and scary. To your point, like a lot of the effects still look really good because they had to be pretty practical. CGI never holds up well over time, and none of this is CGI. So I think it definitely holds up. But I mean, definitely at points there's a few things where you're like, that's how they would have done this 50 years ago.
I also want to point out one other little bit of makeup that I don't think gets called out enough, and because I think that it is done so well that people kind of forget. But Max von Sydow was 44.
Yeah.
When he shot, he
looks a million. Yeah.
Literally our age. And he looks so old in this movie. As I'm watching it and I'm like, wow, this is 50 years old. Oh my God. Wait a sec. Max von Sydow. Like, how old were you? And then I was kind of horrified to look at it and be like, oh, he's the old priest and he's like literally my age. But looks so old in it.
I think, though, about the makeup, I would actually say, so for me, because of that, my favorite parts were all the other things in the movie. What I like about it is the creepiness, the creep factor. I think maybe that's why it's aged well as well, because this is not about like constant jump scares. This is about building up an atmosphere, a lot of question marks about what's going on in the story, and kind of start to see these more sinister things happening. So I actually would say if you take away the whole thing around makeup, like that's not the most important part for me anyway, in terms of what I got out of it. So that's why like it's not a big issue for me, but it was almost like we could have done pretty well without the self hurt and some of that. Like that wasn't really needed for me, but I think everything else about it has stood the test of time.
I think that's right, Michael. I think that's one of the things, right? Like, I think pacing is always a very tricky, delicate balance in a horror movie. And for me, that's one of the things that I think The Exorcist did very well. And it sounds like, you're kind of in a line that it's a great way of keeping the audience engaged and, a little bit, on the edge of their seat, gripping their armrests or whatever. Right. Evan, how does that feel for you? Do you still feel like it's got that creep, that constant fear of what's coming next there?
Absolutely. I think that this film is masterfully paced. It's one of those kind of like master classes in just like continually ratcheting up the tension on things from the opening in Iraq, where you see that there is going to be some kind of battle between good and evil, marked very clearly by Father Marin facing off against the statue of Pazuzu. But that there is always one little creepy or unsettling thing. You go into a horror movie with a certain amount of expectation. I am going to be scared, or I'm going to see scary things. And depending on your disposition, you're like, I can't wait to be scared, or I can't wait to like not be scared by this stuff. And The Exorcist does such a good job of these very small things, like the clock stopping when Marin's in the office of the other archaeologist. It's so small, but very creepy. It's these tiny little things that I think that really help make the big things work so well. One thing I will ask, though, and I realize that I should have asked this off the top, which version did we all watch? Because there are two big ones. There's the original theatrical cut, which is about 2 hours long. And then there's the version you've never seen, aka the director's cut.
That's the one that's like 2 hours 20, something like that, right?
Yeah, and it leans a lot more into some of the faith aspects. It has a lot more subliminality in it, little flashes of the demon face, a lot more. But particularly, it has the spider walk.
Yeah, that's the one I watch. I think that's the only one I've ever seen as well, because
interesting.
You know, like I watched it again in university, so it was after 2000 when it was re-released, and then, you know, it's also the when it went back into theaters, because this has had multiple releases. It's made over $400 million, which again, do some time math, and that's even more than $1 billion. But you know, those re-releases, once they started re-releasing it, it was always the director's cut with all the more stuff. Right. So I don't know that you can find the other version. Maybe you did. I don't know. Michael, which one did you watch? Do you know?
I watched the 2 hours and 1 minute versions. That would have been the theatrical release, I believe.
And that's the one that I watched for this one as well, though I do have both. So something that because they are slightly different films and they are paced differently. For instance, you know, we were talking about the pacing and the plotting. The version you've never seen, the director's cut, which you watched, Chris, starts in Georgetown with a shot of the house, right? And then goes to northern Iraq. No, it
starts in Iraq. So here's the thing I will say.
So there's like three versions then.
It maintains tension. It maintains some fear. What I don't love about this movie and the versions that I've seen, because I went and dug out the original after I'd watched this just to compare notes or whatever too. But I don't love the pacing of this movie. I think pacing is one of the things about this movie that for me isn't my favorite part of this. There's a lot of other stuff I really love. I find for me that there's a lot of those, like, I don't know, I don't really need the prologue in Iraq because it's long, right? It's like 10 minutes.
It's very long.
And it's like, okay, something's going to happen. He's going to unearth. Oh no, he just stood there staring at a statue. Okay. So I think for me, the tension is always there, but for me, that wears a little bit because they're always like building it up maybe a little bit more than they get to. And then they kind of like drop it back down where you're like, there wasn't really a payoff here. What eventually happens is it starts paying off. And I think that's my issue through the first kind of half of this movie is they maintain tension that doesn't really have a payoff until you get maybe 45 minutes in. And, you know, you're like, oh, Reagan's actually possessed now. Oh, okay, cool. Like now this is starting to, and so it's a long build up to that payoff. I think the payoff is great, but I found the pacing a little all over.
I actually really agree with you. And I'm interested now in the extended cut to see if they resolve some of these things, because some of the things are quite obvious to you, Evan, were not obvious to me at all. Like what you were saying that, you know, now that's clearly building up for this battle against the good and evil and big showdown. I didn't actually get that. I didn't make the connection of his connection with the demon until much later. And it was just sort of like, it was an interesting intro. I liked it. I just didn't see how it all fit together. And I didn't get that.
Yeah, it doesn't really pay off. Yeah.
I disagree, because I think it would be a lesser movie without this. Because I've actually thought a lot about that opening and whether or not it would be a better film to lop it off. And I don't think it would be, because then Marin showing up later as the old Exorcist, I think that you then sort of like, well, he just sort of comes out of nowhere and I don't understand this guy. And so I think that it really sort of builds this idea that we're in a place dealing with things we don't understand. And there is some kind of evil, an ancient evil that's been around since time immemorial that still walks this earth, and that this is a person who has faced it down in the past and will face it down again.
Yeah.
And the in terms of like, you know, it doesn't really feel like anything happens for the first 45 minutes. Yes, but you fall in love with the characters. You spend all of that time with the characters and you see that Reagan is a sweet kid and that Chris is a great mom and that Karis is, you know, a good son who's dealing with some really difficult things with an ailing mother and his own sort of like stress and losing faith. And I think that in a lot of ways is what makes this film so arresting and so effective, is that when the big payoffs start happening, you're genuinely upset because you've invested in these characters, and they seem like real people. They feel like people that you don't want these bad things to happen to. And I think that a lot of horror, evolving and moving ahead, starts to shorthand that in favor of kind of pacing. It's like, oh, it's got to be faster. We got to get to the scary stuff. We have to, get it done. And I remember watching like Ghost Ship when it came out in, let's say 2002. And that being one of the most egregious versions of that, where it's like you literally meet a character and he opens his wallet and is like, I can't wait to get home to my daughter. It's like, this is why you should care about me. And then he's like gruesomely killed. And that leaves me cold, whereas this makes me feel invested.
I think it's one of the things about this movie, which you can take whatever way you want. I mean, I think the thing is, we're watching it in 2023. I agree with you that it's an interesting thing because you have these threads of other stories. Like there's a lot going on, right? You've got multiple personal dramas going on throughout, and then you're combining it in with, this supernatural horror and possession and what's happening. And I just found there's a lot of bloat on this movie, which is probably in the book and probably makes a lot of sense when you can, go on at length, because this is based on, a novel, which then got turned into a screenplay. There's a lot of stuff where I'm just like, that could have been shorter. I didn't need as many scenes about Karras's background to understand he's a devoted son and he's got this personal conflict and drama about, he's lost his faith. And there was a lot of all of those. And so I'm not necessarily saying get rid of it. I'm just saying it's a lot. And that first third for me really drags. Like in my notes, there's just a lot of like 10 minutes in, when's something going to happen? 20 minutes in, when's something going to happen? 44 minutes in, something finally happened. And so it's just that, right? I agree with you that I think there's story here which helps give some dimension to the characters. But like, Michael, I'm curious for you, like, how well did you feel the movie did at weaving all of those threads of everybody's backstory and whatever coming together into this kind of supernatural horror thing?
That's exactly what I mean about it was hard for me to see it. It didn't take away my enjoyment, but when I learned later about, he actually does have a personal experience. When they refer to, he's had this exorcism that almost took his life before. The whole connection with the coin or the little pendant was very weird to me. I didn't kind of feel like that all. It wasn't clear to me. It didn't take away from the enjoyment. I just thought that, wow, there's a lot of threads. But because of how it all comes together, because of how it gets revolved, you can still leave satisfied. But this is one of those that when you've read about it later and you rewatch it, then of course that's going to now become just part of how you experience the movie. And I think you enjoy it more. But for this quote unquote first viewing in probably 35, close to 40 years, there were a lot of really unexplained things to me.
Yeah, I think that this film definitely rewards rewatching. So I would urge anybody who watches it, watch it again too. And to that point, I think that the one thing that I really took away this time is that like Pazuzu is playing 4-dimensional chess. That like Pazuzu and Marin have faced off before. It's sort of implied that that's the demon that he met with and exorcised that nearly killed him the first time around, especially because you hear his voice being called out when
the reverse tape.
Karras plays the tape backwards. And so you've got Marin being mentioned there. And, again, you've set up that kind of him staring at Pazuzu in northern Iraq. And you also have in the first time that Karras visits the house and sees Regan in the bed. It's like, oh, are you here to do an exorcism? And would you like that? Yes, it will bring us together. And it's like, oh, that's the demon's plan. The whole time, like the demon wants to kill Marin and take over Karis or kill Karis. There's a moment, and I think it might only be in the extended edition, where after the first round of exorcism and Karis and Marin are sitting on the steps outside the room, and Karis is like, why do demons do this? And Marin's like, it's to make us despair. It's to make us think that God cannot possibly love us because we are so frail and ugly as humans, kind of thing. And again, I'm trying to take this from memory because I haven't seen the extended edition in probably a decade. So Chris, you'll have to remind me if that's about right. But I think that sort of gets to the core, where it's like Pazuzu's plan, not really to, take over Regan and just hold her until she rots, but to like wreak revenge on these emissaries of God, and also, really mess up a innocent child.
Yeah, I think this is always the interesting part as we have these conversations, right? Is the how much do you want to fill in the blanks of what's going on here? I mean, to your point, Evan, that's where I go. It would have been much cooler for me to see a short thing of Father Marin in the beginning doing an exorcism somewhere else, and then be like, okay, cool, let's get, because I think that's where it makes it easier to be like, you could have a short scene that's like somewhere 5 years earlier, and it's like, okay, cool, doing an exorcism and then moving on. I just found there could have been a lot more condensation of this. And I don't necessarily want to be like, wow, look at all these connect the dots and strategies and what, like, I'm like, yeah, it's fine. This isn't what I love about this movie. And I think the thing for me that does make those things much more compelling is the folks who do the roles, who do the acting in those parts, because that's what really keeps a lot of this for me afloat. So
I agree. I just want to circle back for a moment on that idea of like, it would have been great to see 5 years earlier, Marin doing an exorcism. And I think that would have actually undermined the film, because the whole juxtaposition here, I mean, and this is a film built completely on juxtaposition, good versus evil, faith versus, atheism, and, particularly science versus religion. And so if you saw that the demons actually existed off the jump, then I think that would undercut the build of you've got something wrong with Regan. And so you go to science and you go to the doctors and you have what I think are some of the most harrowing moments of this film, which is Regan undergoing the medical tests. And so science has been exhausted. And so then the doctors recommend pseudoscience. They do hypnotism, and hypnotism gets exhausted. And so then the doctors recommend religion, right? And that's okay, well, now it doesn't really matter what you believe, but if she believes that she's possessed, then an exorcism might, help. And so the fact that it's coming from science, and that it's taking the audience on this, like, let's eliminate all of the things that it could be. Oh, this is a real frickin' demon. We need a real exorcism. We've exhausted all other possibilities. This is where we're at now. We are staring into the face of evil. I think that had you gone off the top with like, there are demons in this world, then all of those moments of bringing the audience along, you'd be like, no, obviously all these guys are wrong. Let's just get to, when are we going to get to the fireworks factory? They're obviously wrong.
One of the things, though, that I felt didn't really support that, because I agree with you, like, it's a different movie because they don't prove something in the beginning. But I thought that you know what? I really want to talk about the performances because I think at a few points they don't really match sort of what's going on. But maybe it's a good time to take a break now, and then when we get back, we can kind of get into that a little bit more.
So let's talk about the performances. I mean, we kind of mentioned it up front, right? Linda Blair won a Golden Globe for her performances. Reagan in this movie, Ellen Burstyn, Jason Miller, Max von Sydow, all received award nominations for their performances either at the Oscars or the Golden Globes. Like the performances in this movie are definitely something. Like, do the performances elevate the Exorcist beyond your standard horror movie?
So I'm gonna say yes, because I think, yes, with a caveat. I think that I'm really glad actually that they showed these longer scenes that we kind of talked about earlier, because exactly to Evan's point, I think it establishes that they have a really, really good mother-daughter relationship, and it's really believable. I think it is great to see Max von Sydow earlier and how he carries himself. The acting is really good. The thing that I found was a bit funny, particularly with the mother's acting, was that there were times when I thought this must be down to directing, because I know that she's a great actress, but I thought that the reactions were not proportionate to what's going on around them. And there seemed to be like a detachment going on that didn't resonate with me. So it's a little bit of a yes, but answer. I think that the acting was very, very strong, but sometimes maybe the directing wasn't as clear for what was being asked of them.
Yeah, I think the performances are very good. I think the performances are what kept me engaged in those spots where I found, the story, I don't know, didn't entirely enthrall me, that some of the nuances didn't entirely enthrall me. And to your point, Michael, some of the directing choices I found a little wonky. Like, I found there's a lot of really hard cuts where you're just like, I'm doing a thing, and then suddenly it's like, and here's Reagan screaming at the doctor's office for 3 seconds, and then I'm back over to Father Karras giving mass, and you're like, I found some of those were really jarring, but the acting was what kept me engaged through those parts that I don't love. And I can understand why you might be making some of those directorial choices, or how it's hard to prune the story down or whatever. But like, ultimately, where I don't love those bits and pieces, I do really love the acting. And that is definitely a thing that keeps me engaged and interested and invested in this movie, even though, I've kind of been saying that the pacing isn't great for the first half. Like, ultimately, the pacing for me is like, oh my God, we finally got to the exorcism, and this is fantastic. And some of those threads pay off, some of them don't, but the acting kept me interested the whole way through.
Yeah, I think that the acting in this movie is superb. I think that there are definitely choices made. I mean, to Michael's point, whether or not what's going on screen seems, commensurate with the people's reaction. Like, I think that Ellen Burstyn, not being afraid of the sound going on in the attic or something like that shows that she is, again, like a very strong mother, that she's someone who doesn't scare easily. And, rather than sending somebody else up to go and look up in the attic, she goes up herself. She is willing to go up in the attic. And so when she's really at the end of her rope, with the doctors and everything, you're really seeing a really sort of like frayed and afraid person. I think that one of the performances that probably doesn't get quite shouted up enough is Lee Cobb as Lieutenant Kinnerman. I just think is absolutely delightful. He brings a little bit of levity to things.
Is he trying to date priests? Is that what I'm to draw from this movie? Because he keeps asking a lot of priests to go to the movies with him.
I mean, maybe. There's a whole there's a whole thing about like the way that he is conducting his investigations and trying to keep things kind of light and friendly, so that maybe like always trying to leave the person that he has been kind of in a bit of conflict with on a good note, so that like next time around they may open up to him more. But like to your point, Chris, like Kinnaman and the other priest Tom, like meeting up at the end of the movie, kind of being like, this is going to be the start of a beautiful friendship kind of thing, where they're like walking off, and that's the end of the movie. I think is only in the extended version, whereas I think the other version ends with Tom like looking at down the top of the stairs. And
I found the detective in general was something that I could have largely done without. I mean, or not without entirely, but I think like, again, it's one of those things where I'm like, I could have done with a lot less because I didn't find the police investigation terribly engaged. Like, oh, his head was turned all the way around, and it's okay, I get it, but you know, like I didn't need. I think the thing I found is it's like a little bloat everywhere added up to a lot of bloat for me, and that's where the pacing and story and whatever. Like, I didn't love that stuff, but I mean, I found for me some of the big acting payoffs where you had like. Jason Miller as Father Karras, as the exorcism, he's kind of gotten kicked out of the exorcism or whatever because he was, yelling at the demon or whatever, getting too caught up in what the demon was saying. When he goes back downstairs and Ellen Burstyn is like, is she going to die? And he's like, has that moment of like resolve where he's like, no. And you just see it in his face, and then he heads back upstairs. And like, that is an excellent dramatic payoff. And I think the acting and whatever leads to that point, regardless of what I felt like some of the bloat in his story and his mother, and like, I'm like, there's a little much there, but it really pays off as you go through that final, exorcism scene. Like a lot of those threads really do pay off, and the acting is mwah.
I love the cop too. I think that he's got two things going for him. He's got an excellent vocal delivery. I think his pacing and how he speaks is brilliant. And I actually do think how he lays out like the chances that, a young girl could carry sort of this fully grown man and throw out the window. So I think that he's needed to, for the same reason, Evan, that you were talking about, like they try everything. They try science, they try this, they try that. To be there and kind of like lay out the logical case, like there's something else going on here than kind of what meets the eye. So I actually like him there. I don't think it's overdone to me, but I also get this thing around like a bunch of little things add up to, a long time. But again, I watched the 2-hour movie, so
and I agree that the 220 has a lot of bloat to me. I prefer the theatrical cut.
So the one thing I do definitely want to talk about is like Linda Blair in this movie. I think she was 14 years old when they were making this. Like, talk to me about her performance in this film.
I mean, I think it's so good. Like Regan at the beginning is so sweet and so innocent. And, again, one of the great things about horror is, where, the perversion of innocence is one of those things that like creates like a visceral, feeling of disgust in us. And so she's kind of perfect to be that conduit. When she's like fully let off the hook at the end, and with her tongue going, and she is great as both demon and as like sweet child. And also a big shout out to Mercedes McCambridge, who did the voice of Pazuzu. Chain smoking and gargling eggs and drinking whiskey and then going to the mic to do that. I think it just, and Linda Blair, if then that voice feeling like it can come out of Linda Blair is just great.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff about Linda Blair's performance and the possession of a young girl becoming, like you said, Evan, like sweet to like demonic. That is upsetting. It's disturbing. And there's a lot of things that, for the era when The Exorcist were made would have been disturbing to viewers. But are those things that kind of give you that unsettling, upsetting, disturbing kind of thing still as disturbing for viewers today?
I think they are. So I'll speak for myself. I think that it is still disturbing. And I think, I know I'm going to be an outlier here. I think it is unnecessarily disturbing. I think you can get the point across without some of the particular cursing and some of that self-stabbing. I thought that's not needed. I get how bad this demon is and how bad the transformation is anyway. So in a way, yes, it still works. The disturbing thing really works. And I can only imagine how people reacted 50 years ago. But I would say I could have had a version that didn't have the full extent of it.
So it feels like a little gratuitous or whatever at points for you.
I think it is too much for me. It actually takes away some of the enjoyment, but it's very effective still. And if that is the intent, it's very, very effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as you say, Michael, a little bit of an outlier. I think that the crucifix scene, let's call it, is still to this day. And even though I know it's coming, and I know that I'm preparing myself for that scene, it still is. It still hits me every single time. It's just like, oh my God, this scene is horrific. I mean, the other scenes that I actually find really horrific and terrible, and I think a lot of people forget about them, are the scenes where Reagan's having the medical tests done on her. I think that the lack of music, the close-ups on needles going in, the sounds of the X-ray and MRI machines just banging, the sound design in those scenes, Linda Blair's performances in those scenes where it looks like she's being tortured, the way that they're shot with kind of this that there is sort of like almost a cinema verite. I mean, throughout the film, like that. And I guess that's actually apparently where a lot of people were like vomiting in the aisles and leaving, is during these science scenes, because they are so affecting. Like that's the stuff that's still to this day so disturbing to me.
Yeah, I think right there with you, Evan, that it's disturbing. I feel like, to Michael's point, those are the things that I found like, I don't know that I needed those to make this movie this scary or make the story there. Like, I think you could have dialed parts of these down. Those were the parts that at least 50 years later feel a little bit gratuitous to me, where it's like, all right, to your point, especially where you see the blood spurting out of this little girl's neck and whatever, you're like, I don't know. I mean, I get we're doing medical tests to prove that there's nothing, nothing within the realm of the mortal world that we can do here to help her. But like, some of those bits and pieces feel gratuitous. Same with the crucifix stabbing, which is just like, whoa, that's maybe a little much. But I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that would have been disturbing in the era too, of just like, a little girl cursing at priests and saying these awful things, like, is that still disturbing? I doubt it's as disturbing in 2023 as it was for audiences in 1973. Is it nice? No. But is it as upsetting? No. I also think some of the things that give you that creepy factor are probably still as disturbing, because I mean, I think there's a lot of technical things that went into giving you that creepy crawly feeling on your back, where it's like the sound design and how they did some of that stuff, which is still, I think, for me, like an A+ thing. Like it hasn't that hasn't faded. It is still disturbing and upsetting as they maintain that tension and creepiness throughout.
One thing I will say about the disturbingness and things and the sound, again, this gets into this whole idea of it being a movie of juxtapositions. And I think that like sound and kind of overwhelming sound at sometimes, screams or like the subways, juxtaposed then with silence, is so powerful in this movie. And I have to say, there's actually less music than I kind of remember. Like Tubular Bells,
Yeah, the main theme
kind of
is
the
barely in
Exorcist
there.
theme is barely in there. Right. I remember there being a lot more Tubular Bells, but I think still used incredibly effectively.
Yeah,
but then, I love this movie.
I'm actually with you because I don't think they use it until, well, I forget when, but like a good chunk of the way into the movie when suddenly you hear the theme of the movie and you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. It's not the same as like Halloween, where you are so familiar with the theme of that movie and it plays throughout. In this movie, that kind of main theme is a little bit lost at points because they barely use it. In fact, I would have loved to have heard it more because it is. My wife came downstairs while I was watching it and just the main theme was playing and she's like, ooh, this sounds like a creepy movie and not for me. I'm like, and it's just from that theme song. So I wish again they'd had that through a little bit more.
Yeah, I've got Tubular Bells on 45 and Tanya won't let me play it when she's in the house because she finds it so spooky.
Well, and I think that's one of the great questions, right? This is a movie that is creepy and crawly and, listed as one of the scariest movies ever. Is this a movie that both of you would recommend to somebody who missed it?
I think yes, because I do think it's an important movie, and I think that the right people could also enjoy it. But I would give a couple of caveats up front and kind of say, here are a few things to consider. I actually do think it is one of those. It's worth watching again if you haven't watched it. It's not just dependent on, I watched it when I was a certain number of years old and I love coming back to it. And I think this one actually has merit on its own.
Yeah, I think that I mean, I think that this movie is fantastic. Obviously, I highly recommend it. I highly recommend rewatching this movie as well. I think that there are a lot of different lenses through which you can watch this movie, watching it from a theological point of view, watching it with a feminist perspective is really interesting as well. There are so many different reads, but this is truly like the OG, really scary film. And I think that we don't get a lot of the horror that we love today, or even the horror that we don't love today, without this film. And sometimes almost literally, because I know our feelings on The Lost Boy. In the research for this, I don't know if any of you guys came across this either, but Jason Miller, Father Karras, is Jason Patrick's father. So there is our Lost Boy connection.
Every 6 degrees of The Lost Boys apparently is going to be the new game we play on this podcast.
Oh, I think we can. I think we can play 6 Degrees of Lost Boys for sure.
I think with both of you, I'd say like this is definitely a movie that folks should see. Like it's a really good movie. It's a very good horror movie. I think the exclamation point or asterisks on this for folks is that like, yeah, if you don't like scary movies, it's a scary movie. If you like scary movies and haven't seen this or, to that point, haven't watched this in a while, it's definitely worth, putting on and having that watch. My wife who does not like scary movies would not want to watch this movie. Right. So if you are somebody who does not, it's scary. And like, is it the scariest movie ever? Well, I think that, again, goes back to your personal tastes and preferences and whatever. There's probably, if you watch scary movies, stuff that you might have found scarier. But like, is it worth a watch? And is it kind of a scary movie and whatever? Yeah, it's definitely worth a watch. And I think the interesting thing for me, and I think this is the contrast for Evan and I, is like, I don't love pulling this movie apart. For me, the payoff in this movie is the exorcism, which I would happily watch again and again, without most of the rest of the movie. I found when I was rewatching this and kind of skimming through the original version just to see what the differences were, I found myself fast forwarding to get further into the movie because I don't necessarily love some of the other stuff, like I've been saying, right? The story and the pacing, but I do love the exorcism. So I'm curious for each of you, like this is probably not a thing I'm going to revisit anytime soon, but I'm sure I'll watch it again in, a few years or whatever, maybe when my kids are old enough to get the poop scared out of them. What about for both of you? Is this something you're going to come back to soon?
I will probably not. but I am glad I watched it, but I don't think this is going to be on my list. So, yeah.
I mean, as you know, this is a top 5 movie for me. I love analyzing it. I love watching it through different lenses, thinking about it in different ways every time I revisit it. So, yeah, I mean, I probably won't watch it again for another year, maybe 2, but I'll definitely be coming back to it again and again and again throughout my life.
Well, I think it's, for the folks out there who want to fright, especially as we're in this Scaretober month, something that's worth it for a good spooky evening watch. And on that note, maybe that's a good spot to call it for this week. So that's what we thought about The Exorcist. And we'd love to know what you thought about this movie or any other spooky movie we've been watching. You can always email us at howdidyoumissthisat@gmail.com. Send us any questions or thoughts. Send us some stuff that you might want us to cover, just like Dave did last week for The Lost Boys. And if you enjoy what we're doing...
Thank you, Dave.
And if you enjoy what we're doing here, take a second to rate and review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. And we'll be back with you next week when we're going to continue with Scaretober, and we're going to be watching Us to see if you should double down on this movie or whether it should stay missed. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you then.